So, how do you guys like my intro? Okay, obviously this isn't my intro. This is the intro to the game that I'm reviewing today. It's one of my all-time favorite games, and you've probably never heard of it. And that's the point of this series. For every great video game that makes it huge, there's at least as many that are just as good, but slip under the cracks. So I wanted to go over some of my favorites with you, and ask you to play this game. If I had an actual intro, this is where it would go. Just imagine smash cuts of different video games, maybe like something up-tempo playing, something with a lot of drums in it, I'm thinking. Okay, back to the review. My first installment is the classic LucasArts adventure game, Loom. Right now you're watching the intro to the game, and if you're getting flashbacks seeing a small glowing creature telling a young man to wake up because people are looking for him, don't worry. This is not Ocarina of Time. That is not Navi, and it will definitely never tell you, hey, listen! In fact, it's disappearing from the game forever as we speak. A quick note before I get too far into this. As I mentioned before, this game came out in 1990. I was still a kid at the time, and I remember parts of the game being kind of intense. It's not like gory or anything, but there's some scary bits in there. Now, kids these days might not blink an eye at it. When you got kids watching stuff like Rick and Morty or Stranger Things, they're probably a bit tougher than I was as a kid, but I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, back to the review. You play the game as Bobbin Threadbare, a member of a group called the Guild of Weavers. And yes, you heard me correctly. He's a weaver, and his name is Bobbin Threadbare. Just a warning, if you don't like meaningful, pun-filled names, this is not the game for you. Literally every character you meet has a name that's related to their profession. So before I get into the meat of the game, let me go over the technical aspects of it. The mechanics of the game are pretty simple, so it won't take long. Loom is a point-and-click adventure game. A lot of those came out in the 90s. It was kind of a golden age for the genre. With all these different adventure games out there, Loom had to do something to stand out from the crowd. So what the game designers decided to do was to pare back the interface of the game to its bare essentials. Everything you do in the game can be described as one of three actions: walking somewhere, looking at something, and interacting with that something. The interaction portion is where this game is really unique from any other point-and-click adventure game I've ever played. Instead of other games where you pick up an item, or you open it, or you push it, or whatever, in Loom, you cast a spell on it. As you interact with objects throughout the game, sometimes that object will play a 4-note tune. That tune, which the game calls a draft, is a spell that you use to change the world around you. Most drafts can be cast, or as the game calls it, weaved, backwards, which causes the opposite effect to occur. So, as in the example here, if you cast straw to gold backwards, it'll turn the gold back into straw. And really, that right there is how you play the game. It's that simple. Everything that I've shown so far comes from the game's easiest difficulty, which is called Practice. There's also Standard and Expert. The only thing that really changes in between the difficulties is how easy it is to learn and then weave a draft. In Practice, you have a full musical staff showing you what notes you've unlocked so far, as well as this little box that shows you every note as you're playing it. The only difference between Practice and Standard is that in Standard, the box showing you what note is being played is gone. And then the Expert difficulty, which is what most of these clips come from, there's no musical staff. You have to literally play by ear and use trial and error in order to figure out what each draft is. Personally, I didn't find it all that hard to play the game in Expert mode, but I have musical training, I know how to read music and that, so that probably was a help. The plot is pretty standard fantasy fare. Bobbin is a child born under mysterious circumstances, and he's not trusted by the elders of his guild for reasons they won't explain to him. The game starts with him being summoned by the elders on the morning of his 17th birthday, and he overhears them talking about their plans for him, and unfortunately they're not planning a surprise party. But before they're done being vague and mysterious, which is in the elder job description, a plot device crashes through the window. This particular plot device is a swan who flies around, turns everybody except for Bobbin into swans, and then flies off with them. Happy birthday, Bobbin. Unlike some other LucasArts games, Loom isn't a laugh riot. It does have its moments, however. And the funniest moment, at least in my opinion, is Bobbin's reaction to seeing everybody he knows turn into a flock of swans. Instead of being like, "What just happened?" his response is, "Man, everybody ditched me." I mean, for you and me, watching all of your family and friends get transformed would be some major life-changing event, but I guess for Bobbin, it's just Tuesday morning. Anyway, Bobbin goes on a quest after this. A quest to become a dragon. Okay, no, actually, he goes on a quest to find out what happened to the flock of swans that used to be everybody he knew. That covers the basics, so let's get into the nitty-gritty now. Loom, as I mentioned earlier, was created by Lucasfilm Games, which later changed its name to LucasArts, as in George Lucas, as in Star Wars. The company no longer exists, since once Lucasfilm was bought out by Disney, they got rid of LucasArts and folded all the games into their larger Disney Interactive Studios company. Back when Loom was made, the number one maker of point-and-click adventure games was Sierra, which was known for game series like Space Quest, Police Quest, Leisure Suit Larry. Sierra games were known for a few different things. They were very hard, and not always in a challenging way, sometimes more like an exercise in futility kind of way. For one, your character could die, and not always as the result of doing something stupid. Sometimes doing something that seems completely innocuous could get your character killed off, usually with some kind of mocking message saying about how you should have tried harder. Even more frustratingly, it was very possible to render the game unwinnable. What I mean by that is you could be playing the game and miss doing something that you have no idea you were supposed to do. And hours later, literally hours later, you could find yourself in a situation that there's absolutely no way to get past because of something you missed, and the game has moved on from there, and you can't go back to that place and fix it. Lucasfilm Games thought that it was stupid to penalize players for simple mistakes like that, so they made sure in their games the characters never died, and if there was anything you had to go back for, it was always possible to do so. Now, I'm bringing this up not just as, a piece of video game history, but also because I wanted to point out that Loom kind of breaks that rule. As I've mentioned, throughout the game, you collect drafts that you can weave in order to affect the game. The thing is, there's no way in the game to record these drafts that you've learned. Every time Bobbin heard a draft, I had to write down what it did and the notes that you played in order to create the effect. It's a lot like those old school dungeon crawler role-playing video games where you would have to manually draw the map as you went through the dungeon in order to keep from getting hopelessly lost. You might be saying to yourself, big deal, so it takes a little extra work. The thing is, though, imagine a situation where you lose your notes and you can't go back and hear the draft again. It's not a huge deal. There's only a couple spots in the game where you can't go back anymore, but it could potentially be a problem, and I think that it's something that could have been easily solved just by putting something in the game that lets you keep a copy of the drafts that you've learned. I only have one more complaint about the game, and like the one I just went over now, it's not that big a deal. Loom is short. I mean, that was true of most of the point-and-click adventure games back then, but even by those standards, Loom isn't very long. Also, and no spoilers here, but the game ends on an obvious sequel hook. Sequel hooks are kind of a pet peeve of mine, especially in situations where there's a lot of loose ends left open. But what makes it doubly irksome in this case is that I'm pretty sure the sequel was never made. Now, don't get me wrong, the game has a definite ending, and you do have a sense of closure at the end, but you're still left with the feeling that a lot was left undone, and the stuff left undone would have made for a really cool game. So that covers the negatives of the game, which just leaves the positives, which in my opinion are everything else. Let's start with the music, because I do actually have one minor complaint about it. Anyone paying attention who is a fan of ballet probably spotted this a lot sooner than I did, but it wasn't until Crystal Guard that I said, wait a second, isn't this from the Nutcracker? I went and looked it up, and it turns out that all the music in this game comes from Swan Lake. I had the right composer in mind, at least. Which makes sense, because there's this whole swan motif floating through the whole game. You know, your whole Weaver's Guild gets turned into swans. Bob and Threadbare's mother's name is Cygna, which is like a feminized version of Cygnus, the swan constellation. And I thought it was cool how you use music as the game's interface. Every other adventure game I've ever played is pretty much just variations on a theme, so it's refreshing to see a game that goes in a completely different direction. Now, here's my complaint about the music. There's not enough of it. For large stretches of the game, the soundtrack is completely silent, and I think that's due to hardware limitations at the time. Without going into a big lecture on the history of PC gaming, 1990 was right around the time that real sound cards first started coming out. And since it was new, it wasn't being used in a whole lot. So Loom was reliant on ad-lib sound. Ad-lib was good for the time, but it was limited. I mean, you can hear this game is really putting it through its paces. So I'm no expert in any of this, but I'm thinking that back then, there wasn't really any way to have the soundtrack playing and weave your drafts without it being drowned out. So you can see here, anytime I start hitting notes, the music immediately stops. That's enough about the music. The graphics for this game are good. Like, not just for the time they came out, but good, period. There's this whole movement going on in, like, the indie game community, making games with old school 16-bit style graphics, but that's a stylistic choice. This is a group of people working with what they have and knocking it out of the park. The plot is good, too. It takes a lot of classic fantasy tropes like the hero's journey, but it does it in its own way. It's not just a rip-off of Lord of the Rings. I like Bobbin, too. A lot of these point-and-click adventure games, especially the more comedic ones, they like to make the main character this dopey loser, which kind of makes you wonder how he's able to solve all these intricate puzzles. But Bobbin's got a good head on his shoulders. He seems like he could actually do the stuff that you're having him do. And he likes to make sarcastic comments sometimes, but it's not like everything out of his mouth is some snarky comment. Probably because his game came out in 1990, before video game characters were required to have attitude. I mentioned before that this game is made by LucasArts. They're best known for a different point-and-click adventure game, and if you ever played that one, you might have heard of this game from that. In fact, if you have played that game, you've probably been sitting here this whole time wondering if I was ever going to bring it up. Yep, that's right. The Secret of Monkey Island. All the way in the beginning of the game, when you walk into the bar, One of the pirates is wearing a pin that says, "Ask me about Loom." And if you do, he jumps into this blatantly obvious and heavily lampshaded sales pitch for the game. And something I never realized before I started putting this video together, the quote-unquote pirate that you talk to bears a striking resemblance to a character from Loom. See, take this guy, put a kid's pirate hat and a fake beard on him, and it's the same guy, which is probably exactly what they were going for. Okay, so that's the review. It was a short review, so I'll give a short recap. What I didn't like about it is that it's short, and for a game that's built all around music, there's not a lot of it in there. And the sequel hook was annoying, but it probably would not have been as annoying if the sequel had actually come out. Now, I've read an interview with the game creator, and he claims he didn't have any sequels in mind when he was writing Loom, but just play the game for yourself, and I think you'll agree with me. There's no way he wrote that ending with nothing else in mind for the future. And that just leaves everything I did like about the game, which was everything else. So it's not a perfect game, but it is still one of my favorites. A game that I still play 30 years after it came out. And that is why I invite you to play this game. Was that too much? Maybe. Goodbye, everyone.